Welcome and thank you for coming to Natalia Arbelaez's Visiting Artist Lecture. It is the first lecture in the North Seattle College Art Gallery's 2021-2022 Visiting Artist Lecture Series, and the 19th since we began the series last fall. I'm Amanda Knowles, the curator of the NSC Art Gallery and printmaking and drawing instructor in the art department here at North Seattle College. I am pleased to work with Karen Stoldreyer, who assists in the gallery. We have live transcript available for those who want it. Those of you who don't want it or find it distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and selecting hide subtitle. Use it if you wish, hide it if you wish, but we want to make sure that we have it for those of you who need it. First, some acknowledgements, and I will share my screen for that. The land acknowledgement. North Seattle College acknowledges that we occupy the land of the Coast Salish peoples, the descendants of the first peoples of this region, a people whose cultures endure and are valued. Without this land and these cultures, we would not have access to this gathering, dialogue, and learning space. We take this moment to honor and thank the original caretakers of this land, their ancestors, and all who are still here. We encourage participants here to consider our responsibilities as we stand in solidarity with the sovereignty, cultural heritage, and lives of Native, Indigenous, and First Nations peoples. Also, a labor acknowledgement. We also pause to acknowledge and recognize the labor that created the United States and from which we all benefit. We remember that our nation is built on the labor of enslaved people who were forcibly brought to the US from the African continent, and we recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We acknowledge immigrant labor and recognize that voluntary, forced, and prison labor contribute to the building and ongoing maintenance of our nation. We acknowledge all unpaid caregiving labor. Additionally, we acknowledge the critical importance of the work towards racial equity that continues across this country in response to racial injustice and generations of structural racism against BIPOC communities. This next slide shows what we are doing to continue the work to go from acknowledgement to deed. It is not enough to just acknowledge the land and labor. We want to be sure that we are taking action. We show you here what actions North Seattle College and the NSC Art Department are taking to support BIPOC individuals and institutions and be held accountable. We recommend Real Rent Duwamish, and we will put the link in the chat for you to explore. Thank you. Although we are not yet mounting shows in the art gallery, we will be back in winter quarter, so January 2022, with a group show entitled The Sun, the Moon, and Stars. Until then, we are working to continue to connect with artists and have them enliven our campus community. As I said earlier, today is the fourth lecture of the winter quarter. We will have lectures every other Monday at noon. The next lecture is actually the last of the quarter and will be a lecture by Sangram Mujumdar on Monday, December 6th. I urge you to visit our website for links to recordings of all this quarter's talks, as well as last year's lectures and list of upcoming visiting artists. We will post all of our links in the chat. Additionally, the NSC pop-up fall art and craft sale will be taking place on Wednesday, December 1st, next Wednesday, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. on campus in the Grove. If you are a current NSC student, alumni, or current continuing ed student, and you missed the deadline to apply to be a vendor, you can have the rest of the day today to get your application in. So the extended deadline is midnight tonight. There is no fee to get a table, and you keep 100% of the proceeds. Setup is at 10 a.m. on December 1st. The link is in the chat. Good, so thank you. And on to our visiting artists. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Natalia Arbelaez. Natalia is a Colombian American artist born and raised in Miami, Florida, to immigrant parents. She received her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Florida International University and her Master of Fine Arts degree from the Ohio State University with an enrichment fellowship. In 2016-17, she was a Rittenberg Fellow at the Clay Art Center in Portchester, New York, and was awarded the inaugural Art Access Fellowship that funded a residency to Watershed Center for the Ceramic Arts in Newcastle, Maine. Her work has been exhibited in many solo and group shows, both nationally and internationally. To bring it home to Seattle, in May, her work was included in Always On, Art and Motherhood at Royal Gallery in Pioneer Square, curated by our own Paula Rebson and Kelda Martinson. Her work is included in various collections such as the Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, and the Museum of Art and Design in New York City. She has been recognized by NSC as a 2018 Emerging Artist and was a 2018-19 resident artist in the ceramics program at Harvard University, where she researched pre-Colombian art and histories. Natalia was an artist in residence at the Museum of Art and Design in New York City, where she researched the work of historical and influential women ceramicists of color and continued this research as a visiting artist at the American Museum of Ceramic Art in Pomona, California. She is currently at a residency at the Wasaic Project in New York State and will soon head to another residency at the Pittsburgh Art Center. Natalia is the co-founder of the Color Network, whose mission is to aid in the advancement of people of color in ceramic arts. Their aim is to assist artists develop network and create dialogue while maintaining a place for a database, resources, and mentorship. They hope to foster a community of artists of all professional and skill levels that help each other grow. She has taught ceramics at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, Harvard University, the College of New Rochelle, the Clay Art Center, and the Ohio State University. I will hand it over to Natalia, but before I do, I want to let the audience know that we will be taking questions in the chat today. So if questions or comments arise during the talk, please write them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to each one of them. We'll be sending a transcript of the chat to Natalia after the talk. So if you want to comment on the work and her words, please do. You might be specific about what you're commenting on, as Natalia will see your words after the talk, but I urge you to support her and her work in the chat. Thank you so much to speak with us, Natalia, and welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Amanda, for orchestrating this. I'm gonna start. I'm coming from Wasaic Project right now, Wasaic, New York, where I live 30 minutes away, but I'm doing a residency that's part of an installation I'm doing here. It's a really great residency. I suggest any artists to look it up. They house you, they give you a place to work, and it's in a beautiful environment, or kind of upstate Hudson Valley region, New York. Okay, so yeah, thank you again for having me. So I like to start my talks in a personal place about how my family got to the States and where my family comes from. It's really important in my work, and it's a reason why I make the work that I do. So I start at this place, and it's a recognizing of where I came from. So my mother came to the States when she was 16 and pregnant with me from Medellin, Colombia. And I was born in Miami, Florida, but we shortly after moved back to Colombia. But here is a kind of a record, an archive of my mother coming to United States and that celebration of her coming over. I started this work as a way to document the stories that weren't being told in American history, even though this is part of American history and my family's history. And my father came over when he was 19 from Colombia, but he took a plane from Colombia to Panama, Panama to the Bahamas, and then a boat from the Bahamas where he was stranded at sea. This one is titled 30 Days at Sea. He left after my mother because he was not able to obtain a visa to come to the States. So he came over through other means and then was stranded at sea, then was stranded at this island called Cat's Cay Island off of the coast of the Keys. So it was a residential island. And I did this work to celebrate and to also document immigrant stories and to bring attention to the value that's placed on certain lives or the non-value. And something that I always think about in this story is when the guy whose boat broke down and he left his boat and my father on Cat's Cay, he said, when I come back to get my boat. If you're still alive, I will bring you back to the States, and how little value was given to him and how little value was given to certain immigrants. So about my family, we come from Medellin, Colombia. Medellin's really gorgeous. It's in a valley surrounded by mountains. And my mother and I moved back to Medellin when I was about 2 months old. So I grew up my first 4 years in Colombia, even though I was born here. I grew up on the outskirts. So you would see the valley, but if you went over, it's just beautiful mountains. And this is where I grew up, on the outskirts of Medellin, in farms and mountains. So here's my portrait of the mountains. In my work, you'll see it pretty often. In a lot of pre-Columbian work, you'll often see triangles, and it's referencing the mountains. That's where my family comes from. That's where my ancestors come from the Andes Mountains. So it is a big part in my work. And this is a portrait of me where I lived on a farm for the first 4 years of my life, kind of, no schooling, just running wild. And a little more about Colombia. These are the Muisca people, who are a little more north, but through the Andes, pre-Columbian people that disappeared once Columbus came over. People in South America tend to have 20 to 30% indigenous ancestry, 20 to 50% mixed with the European ancestry. Here are the contemporary indigenous people, the Tierrona, who have claim to being contemporaries of the Muisca people who have disappeared. So there's a really big mix but there is that history of that everyone that comes from majority of these countries have that ancestry, whether it's celebrated, acknowledged, or even talked about in the home. And just another big influence from the Quimbaya people, gold, which we'll see is a reoccurring theme in my work, really important. And Colombia was really rich in gold. And that's a lot of the artwork that I look at for Colombia is gold. So at 4 years old, I moved back to the States with my mother. And even though I'm not an immigrant, I really identify as an immigrant because I did have to move back to the States and assimilate. I had to kind of learn to be an American. And, I think it was in the first month I learned English, but I forgot Spanish within a month. And back then it was really encouraged that if you wanted to become an American, you had to move forward and forget about your past. So learning English, but forgetting Spanish, and being encouraged to forget things. And so my mother became a factory worker, and we were very excited and very interested in assimilating and becoming Americans. But at the age of 11, I moved to Miami, Florida, where I was born. And I slowly started reconnecting with my culture and heritage of, I relearned Spanish. I started visiting Colombia in the summers and reconnecting with my father, reconnecting with the land and the food and the culture. And I think because I had experienced such a significant life event of, losing culture and then regaining it, I could say that is like a big event of why I make the work that I do and why I'm connecting to culture, histories, and stories, is because as a young person, I had to actively seek that out. So I'm continually doing that. And my work is a stand-in for me to reconnect personally, and as well as filling in gaps in the history of my own history. And then like this broader picture of indigenous history, Latin American history, and Latin American history in United States context. So I went to Florida International University as a sculpture major, and I always did clay, but I would always go back and forth. So I would say some of my biggest influences when I was in undergrad were storytellers, but through movies. I was really interested in like Holy Mountain, which Alejandro Jodorowsky directed, and this piece was about John Waters and Almodovar. I was interested in storytelling, and I was telling myself that's what my work was about movies. But as I look back and I can reflect, I started a family while I was an undergrad. I became a mother. I was making work about becoming a mother, but because I wasn't supported in that role while I was going to school, at that time, I think identity politics, identity work, and especially work about being a mother was like the last thing you wanted to do. It was something that was not respected, that kind of work. So I don't know if that was in the subconscious, but it was obvious that making repeated forms, I was making work about my identity, the things that I was going through, but couldn't acknowledge that or couldn't claim that for myself, that I was a storyteller. So I spent a good amount of time in undergrad. I took the extra time to really develop a great portfolio. And because of that, I was able to get a full ride to Ohio State University with an enrichment fellowship and a teaching opportunity. And this is the work that I started while I was at Ohio State. And when I applied to grad school, I wasn't quite sure where I belonged because I came from a sculpture program, but I was interested in ceramics. And I just applied to both, I found schools that I liked their sculpture program and their ceramic program, and that they possibly had a fiber program, and just kind of let them decide. And I ended up getting into the ceramic program, which I'm grateful for because of all of the components of ceramics that, there's the glaze chemistry and there's the very specific things to ceramic, which I didn't know coming from undergrad department. So here's just some of the work that I was doing when I came in. I was really interested in process. And this is where I started really slowly being able to question identity and culture and heritage. And this is some of the work where I was using molds to do that and talking about genetic memory and stacking these things. So I came into this program being very heavily process-based into ceramics as I was, approaching the program. And then, moving into more experimental, smaller pieces that I could be experimental with. And I was really just interested in process. I really wanted to learn all the processes that I was offered, all the mediums and everything. So I was just collecting everything that I could while I was at school. And still incorporating other materials. I really, I enjoy paper to porcelain to glitter and, spray foam. For me, it's all in the same. I'm not into the hierarchy, and also different mediums as well. So I made this website while I was in grad school, Interface Shrine, and I was creating shrines for people to access through me. And I was taking place as a medium. And when people clicked on me through the site, they can access a space for people to obtain their objects. So, as well, they were giving me prompts. People were giving me prompts at the website, and I could take your prompts, whether it was a prayer, a thought, an intention, and I was turning those intangible thoughts into tangible objects that people can access in this virtual space. So I was interested in all, medium and media. And then finally, my third year, I think I honed it in of being able to experiment for that long. I did my thesis, and it was called Insignificant Grandeur. And it was starting to reference a lot of the pre-Colombian ceramic and gold pieces that I started looking at from the Andes and I guess most of from Latin America area. And as you could see, my form started simplifying. I was interested in how pre-Columbian people use the essence of a body to reference instead of trying to reference something specifically. So my form started turning more zoomorphic. And this is a quimbaya piece from Colombia. And I was interested in how just the slits, reference eyes or the mouth, and the forms were just so simplistic, but you knew that it was a body or a human. So it was just about the essence, not, trying to reference something. And I started looking at that and starting to slowly, move into simplified forms. and more expression. So this was all for my thesis. And I took it out of this talk, but another really big influence is shrines. I often look at lots of shrines. The Catholic shrine, I consider myself culturally Catholic, not spiritually, just, coming from Latin America. And then the shrines too, that I'm really interested in, the shrines that I grew up from back home of the Santeria shrines of like my Cuban friends, the ones where the old religions of from the indigenous religions or the African religions, like seeping in through Catholic religion of like trying to hold on to those things, but using saints to take on meaning or personifications of other energies or, meaning. So that's often my kind of how I lay things out, that I'm interested in how people look at things. So after I left grad school, I graduated 2015. I think around 2016, I started a residency and moved to Port Chester, New York. And it was a residency at the Clay Art Center. I was a Barbara Rittenberg Fellow. And this is where I started the work that I showed you in the beginning of my slide, where I started documenting my family's immigration stories. This piece was the kickoff to that. It's called Stories of Our History, and the whole series is called Stories of My History. And this one is a self-portrait of my son and I. And this is where I really claimed for myself being a storyteller, where I could really say, like, yes, I'm a storyteller. I am documenting these stories. I am archiving these stories of my family, and really understanding the purpose of that. And it's a portrait of my son and I, I want to storytell because I want to pass down these stories to my family. I want to pass these down to my son. I want to pass this down to the next generation. And I want to do it in a way that's honoring and celebrating and acknowledging and documenting at a time, especially in 2016, when immigration and immigrants were being so looked down upon. And it's a point of shame for some families. When I try to talk to my family and get little bits and pieces, there's an uncomfortableness. So it was a whole project about talking and documenting and archiving. So, and this series also started to use historical objects, bringing that into the work to reference Colombia. And so this one is called Colombian Death Mask, and it's referencing the Muiscas people golden death mask that they would place on the dead. And I'm interweaving these historical objects with these personal narratives of being away from Colombia and being away from family on missing significant life events like funerals, births, weddings, and celebrations. So using my work to create ritual and ceremony and interweaving these different histories together. So these are all lost aunts and uncles from Colombia. And here's the mask from the Muisca people. And it's a life-size mask, golden hammered out metal, gold that they would use. So that's where a lot of my facial features come from, is these Colombian death masks. And as well as looking at fertility and maternity figures in pre-Columbian work, and how the mother is celebrated and how the mother is, documented and looked at as opposed to in contemporary time. And, bringing in my experiences and my stories with that, my narratives. And around this time, around 2017, 18, there started to be a lot more shows that were asking people to, especially people of color, what is their experience of being an American. And this is one from a show called Us at Port Chester. And so this one is called Anchor Baby, and it's speaking of my experience of being an anchor baby, being called an anchor baby, and how that term could feel derogatory, even though when I've been called it, I don't think it was malicious, but the just kind of implying that is because this piece was meant to kind of dispel any misconceptions of immigration and the process of it. And, you know, seeing my mother go through getting her residency or, you know, becoming a citizen. And it was a long process that happened, you know, like 15 years later of her moving here. And that, you know, the concept like that people think people could just come over here and bring their whole family is completely untrue. So this work was to kind of dispel that and, you know, thinking about my mother's immigration story and how she became a citizen and that long experience, and was also about the duality of how I feel as being an American, because my mother will be the first person when I complain about the United States to, you know, remind me of how privileged we are to live here and how hard it is in other countries. But on the other hand, especially at that time, how I was feeling certain immigrants and certain demographics are treated in the United States. And I feel like that's very true now, is what we're, you know, seeing in the news. You know, it's like a new reflection of how some cases are turning out right now. And this one too happened around the same time. And this one was called, so the first one was called Us, and this one was called US. And it was also asking us to speak on, you know, being an American. And for this one, I chose to use the Statue of Liberty, who's a cultural icon who is using immigration and women to as a symbol. So I use this piece to research the Statue of Liberty and at the time of when it was being erected, and, you know, what was happening then, and, you know, looking at immigration then and thinking about how, you know, women were only given citizenship based off of who they were married. Only a few Black people had citizenship. Native Americans did not have citizenship at the time in the United States. And there was only a certain type of immigrant that was wanted, who was, you know, it was like a white male, that's who got citizenship. And then the wife was second tier to like whatever the man's status was. So looking at it back then to looking at it now, and while lots has changed, there's still an ideal European immigrant that, especially at that time, that the president, I remember his comment of saying, "Why do only people from shithole countries want to come here?" So it was thinking about that and thinking of those parallels of then to now. And so I made the shift to terracotta slowly. I used to use stonewares and porcelain. And as I was referencing more historical objects from Latin America and pre-Colombian art pieces, artifacts, I really wanted to shift to terracotta, but it kind of took me a while. Terracotta in the ceramic world is seen as a lesser material. It's very associated with the land, and it's often covered. And as I was referencing these historical objects and bringing gold in, I found it, the contrast really interesting. And I was thinking about the value that certain people, certain cultures place on objects, and thinking about how did my ancestors place, you know, hierarchy onto different materials or value. And, you know, it really wasn't about one over the other. And I am so interested in how a lot of the gold objects from Colombia were often covered in copper or silver. It was about the symbolism and the rituals that were taking place. And I often think of how the Spanish came over and looking for all the gold, and how they depleted other resources like our lakes, draining them to look for the gold, in which this is the story of El Dorado, and that is the story of the Spanish coming over to Colombia to collect the gold and look for the gold. And it was also a story that was used to make the Spanish keep moving. So there's different iterations of this story. And I like to think about the material and the hierarchy of value that they have even now and to then. And I think it's interesting because this terracotta clay is found in the same places that the gold is found. It's found in the mountains, it's found in the rivers, and it's seen as both in the same for many different ancestors in Colombia. So, and then here you could see some of the historical objects that I'm looking at. On the left, this is a papora. This is an actual historical object. It was used to store lime, and lime was used to chew coca leaves. It was to extend the coca leaves, and it was a sacred object, and the coca leaves as well is like a sacred practice. And on the right, you have the little head, and the ones I'm recreating these objects, but I'm also recreating them by interweaving different objects that I research to create these new objects that I'm interpreting. So, and then after around 2018, like a year or so after I left the Clay Art Center, I started a year-long residency at the ceramic program at Harvard University. And I really started thinking about how I was moving through spaces later on, as I really wanted to be able to use resources, and I wanted to be able to possibly share those resources, and understanding the access that I have and the privilege that I have to move through these spaces. So with this residency, I had access to all of Harvard's libraries and their collections. And they have this, the Peabody collection, which has one of the largest Amerindian collection here in the Americas. They have more pre-Columbian objects here than a lot of people back home even have access to, or even being able to like see it or interact with these objects. So I took on this residency as hoping and thinking that I can interact with these objects, I could document, I can archive, and I could recreate to acknowledge where these things are coming from, where they are, and hopefully give some kind of access back to my community. So this was one of the pieces that I was interacting with the most. It's a moche from a Peruvian moche vessel, and I believe it's 8th century AD. So it's a war captive, the guy looking up with a puma fighting down on this war captive. And in pre-Columbian work, a lot of pumas or cats are warriors, and they're referencing war and killing captors. So I started to recreate some of those pieces I was interacting with, and using that stirrup. The stirrup is referencing two rivers coming together to become one. So when I research pieces, it extends past just the use or the people. I'm interested in what was happening at the time, who were the people, what were the symbolisms, and things like the language. And in this research of this piece, I came across the information that the Mochita language from the Moche people was lost in the 1920s, and thinking about how long that was, not long ago, to lose a whole language. So I started naming these pieces after the Quechua language, which is another language adjacent to the Mochita language. So I'm interested in all aspects of like what information I could get, what information I could write down, and how can I share that. So I started recreating that, and this one's titled Mayu Chimpe, which means cross river. And the Quechua language is spoken all through South America. It's one of the largest indigenous language that's still spoken. And that stirrup is really important, as it's rivers are really important as a sacrifice spot. It's a place where when two rivers are coming together, some of the rituals happen at that place, and that's why they were meant to mimic that. So that's just some of the way that I research and incorporate that into my practice. So, and then also at this time, I started incorporating this glaze. It's called Maiolica. It's a glaze that comes from in South and Central America. The Spanish brought over in 15th century, but it was created in the Middle East, moved through Morocco to Spain, and then Italy, where it's really famous for. But the Spanish brought it over. And I've started using it in my work as a metaphor for my Spanish ancestry and exposing the terracotta as a reference for land and my indigenous ancestry and bringing these two together. And I feel like the Maiolica was a perfect metaphor for that, because Maiolica was created as a way to mimic porcelain, and it was created to hide terracotta because in the ceramic field, it's seen as a lesser material. So if you could cover that undesired clay body with this white, it could give it more value. So I started, using that as a metaphor for colorism and colonialism and those different ancestries coming together into my work. And I got more specific into that as I started creating polarizing figures in my work to reference that ancestry of the pushback and the fight back of, because of, I would go to Colombia through my summers and just kind of understanding that it's an ancestry that's not celebrated or not acknowledged in the home, but there's still acknowledgement in different ways that are very derogatory. It's very strange. So I was interested in stacking to talk about that hierarchy. So I'd often place, the conquistadors at the top, and then down would be either, your mestizo or your indigenous person. And mestizo means, and this series is the kickoff of my mestizo series, is a person who is mixed of European and indigenous ancestry. And I would say that majority of Latin American and South American people are that. So this is that series. And I started creating kind of the scene of struggle. Often the bottom figure was a symbol for the land, because that was really what the Spanish were after. And, stacking all of these figures that are fighting and having some that had some of that white glaze and playing with those histories, and of course bringing in the gold. And I really just wanted to talk about those different ancestries coming together and the value, and how one is not more valuable than the other, and one's not, they each have their own beauty. So here's a plate from Iznikware from the Middle East that some of this trajectory, the history of this glaze moving around. So I'm really interested in these histories and how material plays in it, because the material has a rich history of where it's even presently coming from and where did it come from. So the more recent work, 2019, I've actually been recreating some of those stories like El Dorado. And I thought, as if I can insert myself into these stories and reenact them, it's a very close way of me being able to reclaim. So I went through the steps of creating tangible archives of the stories. And now, as almost for me, but I'm documenting the process, I am creating these ceremonies and inserting myself, and I'm able to hold something for myself. The photograph is a documentation of that. And I get to perform and create ritual with this. And I have a video, so I've been doing video work as well with this. So it's just gonna loop. It's almost done. So it just loops. And what I was interested in is talking about these multiple identities, these hyphenated experiences and hyphenated identities of being mestizo, South American, like latchkey after school, cartoon upbringing, of like all of these different things that make me this contemporary person, but that all of these histories have made me what I am, and acknowledging all of these different histories. And so bringing in this, you know, pre-Columbian history from the El Dorado people to talking about the music, which I had my friend make from Miami, of like growing up dancing to booty music and going to clubs in Miami, to even being an artist and bringing all of these experiences together. And that was what I'm interested in. So all of these pieces were part of my exit show for the ceramic program at Harvard. And along with the video, I had a series of photographs, like the first that you saw, and then these. And the show was called Passages of Absence. And it was all about things that I missed out on living here in the States, from Colombia, from the historical things to, you know, the cultural treasures, to the experiences of family and things like funerals. And this one is on the left, it's ceremonies for Gonzalez, and on the right is for my grandmother. And on the left, I'm recreating pre-Columbian burial rituals with creating ceremony for remembering my grandmother, because I wasn't able to go to her funeral. So creating ceremony for myself through my work, but interweaving those historical elements. And on the right, creating that archive of my grandmother, the physical, tangible archive. And on the left, you know, creating these personal moments for myself through my work that's for me, but having the documentation that I get to share with people. So I've been thinking about all of these different ways that the art, you know, works for myself, for the viewer, and how it exists in the world. So I'm interested in like activating clay and, you know, in these different ways. So, and here's my kind of funeral dress, which is my grandmother's on the right. This clothing is like this historical period clothing that the mountain people from Colombia wore. It's like peasant wear, but it's just interesting how this clothing comes back in history in different ways. And it's just kind of inserting all of these stories and histories. So, and then as well as the cultural treasures, you know, I did get to experience Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but through a different, you know, lens of as an older person, but not growing up in Colombia, and getting to experience his book like firsthand through, you know, the Spanish language as a speaker. You know, I have Spanish, but it's not the same. And then on the right is Deborah Arango, who is a painter from Medellin. So I was recreating some of their stories, and in doing so, I'm researching for myself as well. So this is his story of 100 Years of Solitude, and I recreated all of the little scenes from the book. And in doing so, I think I realized that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is my biggest influence and what I aspire to do in my work. He takes these historical stories, but he inserts his personal narratives, because a lot of the characters are based off of his family members, but there's this surreal storytelling. There's giants, there's floods, and there's ghosts, and there's magic. And it's like, I was like, yes, that's what I want to do in my work. And then Deborah Arango, who was a really amazing painter and who was making work in the 20s and 30s about sex workers and about the Catholic Church. And she was very outspoken. So trying to gain this kind of all-encompassing cultural, you know, lens of Colombia, and, you know, experience it how I could. So then one of my last projects I've been working on that started at the Mad Museum in 2019, 2020. I was a resident there for 6 months. It's in New York City. It's a great residency where you get space in the museum. And I proposed to go through their permanent collection and document women of color in their ceramics permanent collection as a way to celebrate and give myself that ceramic or that art history that I missed out on in academia. And in that project, I could also, celebrate their collection and celebrate the women, but also bring attention to how small that collection is. They only have 11 women of color in that collection, as opposed to 11 pieces of just Peter Voulkos. So it's, I wanted to document the women. I wanted to document their personality. I also wanted to connect to the work a little bit aesthetically. So I did pick 5 women out of the 11 women. That was Lucy Lewis, who is a Pueblo potter, Native American potter. She's really important because she's one of the first potters to step out as an individual and start signing work and taking the liberties to change some of the cultural work and, put in her own perspective. So just little things like, her not speaking English, trying to put that in the person of that figure of, her shyness and, but putting her on her work and still talking about my work. Catherine Choi, who opened the Clay Art Center where I was a resident. And this one was really, I feel like, personal because she created space that I was able to access and make work in. And she created the Clay Art Center in 1958 and she passed away in 1959. And not many people know about her work because she was so young and she didn't have a legacy to leave her work off to. So I kind of think of it as like, I need to continue her legacy as someone who has given me something I want to give back. So this is Catherine Choi on one of her forms. She made some really beautiful forms. Margaret Ponce Israel, who people don't know about, she died kind of young as well. And she was making work in the 60s and 70s on here on the right. It's like a life-size sculpture. And I feel that she's on par with Nevelson and Hesse and, was making work at the same time, but as well, for some reason, her work is not as well known. And this is my reinterpretation of her piece and my celebration of her. Patty Warashina, who is still alive today. I'm sure you all know her. She's in the area. This is her, on the right is her piece in the Mad Museum collection. It's a golden kiln. And with this project, it's been a really rich experience because not only am I documenting these women, some of these women I'm reaching out to and I'm establishing a relationship with and connecting with them. And I was able to learn and speak to Patty directly. And she told me a little bit about this project that she started. And back in the 60s or 70s, she was creating her own little kilns because she said that back then the men weren't allowing the women to partake in the kiln building process because it was viewed as men's work. So she took it upon herself that if I'm not going to be allowed to be a part of this process, I'm going to do it in my own way. And I really related to that. And so this is also Patty's work on the right. Eventually those little kilns turned into cars to speak of the macho culture in ceramics and, using the flames. And on the top is like one of Patty's signature pieces. And so on the left, I recreated a piece of Patty on one of her cars, kind of, holding on her hat because she's a trailblazer in the field of ceramics and all that she has done. And to speak of that story. Sana Mususama, who I have become friends with, and we got to spend time at Watershed this summer, and is a New York native around here where I'm at. And speaking to her and getting to hear of her experiences of traveling through Africa and Asian countries and South America as a single Black woman, and how she's worked with a lot of women and children and bringing that into her work. And then also just hearing of her experience of navigating the ceramic field in the 80s as a Black woman and navigating Alfred in that way. And so she was a very positive light in, you know, in many cases that, you know, I can't imagine like how she felt or experienced. So I placed Sana over the world with her little plane because her travels are so important in her work. So, and then the latest place that before WSAIC that I was a resident was at Amoca, and I was continuing that project. So I was being able to go through their collections and documenting, archiving, and I plan to hopefully in the future have a list where people can access those women, even if I haven't created physical works of them, but I will make a list for Mad Museum at Amoca. I'm in the phase of still going through all of my research while I was at Amoca. I was making while there too, but I can't research and make at the same time for that same body of work. I'll be working on like a different body of work, but doing the research for something else. So I was going through their storage cases. That has really been my kind of driving force now as I move through spaces and residencies of like, what can I access? And, you know, what can the place provide me as well as I provide them? So as well, I was going through their pre-Colombian collection and getting to physically hold and interact with objects, which is really important for me. And that's actually the next phase of my work. So lastly, I just want to talk about the Color Network that I'm a co-founder of. And it's a place where we created database for artists of color, a networking place for artists to find each other and help each other grow in different professional levels. And not only is it for artists of color, it's for any educator or curator or writer looking to broaden their roster, you know, to kind of branch out past their own networks. If they're interested in looking for artists, we have that database that anyone can get to. And, you know, we've been recently starting to do grants, helping with application process. So it's a labor of love. And while it's like a different project than my art, I, you know, always want to kind of talk about it and promote it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So rich. You said that you were going to be putting out a list at some point. Would that be on your website or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's just sort of something
yeah.
to check back for.
Yeah. I hope to make a list and, you know, also put the photos of the women I've been working on and then the women that aren't part of the project, but are in these collections.
Great. Yeah. What a beautiful mix of like the head-based and the hand-based throughout all of this. I really appreciate the academic and the, you know, and the more making realm of that.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions. I actually wonder if I can get you to stop sharing so that, because there are a couple people who sounded like I needed to have their voice. And so I was wondering if Carolina Ferreiro asked a couple questions, and it starts, I appreciate how much storytelling is involved with all the pieces and how they reflect stories that need to be told. I do want to share though, that the Muscat people still exist in Colombia. The population is very small, but they're still there.
Yeah, no, the Tierrona say that they come from the Muisca people, but so it's like it's been changed and divided.
Okay, and I know and then there's a couple other things from her as well, and one thing was you hit me viscerally. I've lived in the U.S. for 24 years, and the grief that comes from losing that time from family and culture is so deep. Thank you for sharing. Carolina, do you want to unmute and just ask any of the questions that come up during all of this, or? Okay. She also put some resources in the chat. So.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Shakira Adams says, the parenting portrayals in your work have a visceral response for me. As a solo parent myself, I can relate and see the misrepresentation in society in your work for parents. Thank you for creating and sharing this work. I hope as people see your work, this makes them think how challenging and the lack of support there is for parents. So that was sort of earlier on. Just kind of going through. From Kelda, this has been so inspiring, and I'm deeper in love with your work, although I already was. Do you have any stories from your residencies about how you were or were not supported as a parent, or any tips on how to manage that when not at a specific parent-friendly residency?
Yeah, no, it's been really hard. Like, I'd say of all of, I think a lot of people try to ask me as being like a woman of color, if, I've reached any obstacles. I think it's actually been harder to be a mother in this than like a POC. I know when I went to grad school, I just didn't tell anyone I was married or had a kid. I always had that fear of people not wanting me because I'm a mother, thinking that I'm not going to be as devoted or hardworking. But I think that that's further from the truth. So I think that it's just been times where I don't say anything until I show up with my family, and I know people are like, well, too late, I'm here. And there was one residency where there's a possibility for a second year, and I know they didn't ask me back because of being a mother, because sometimes I have to bring my son into the studio. I've just been trying to not say anything. I know it's changing now as my career has changed. So when I did Harvard, that was the first place that I was ever able to come and tell people I want to do this, and I want to do this residency and live here during the week and go back home to be with my family on the weekend. And people were supportive of me for the first time in that way. So I think it's mostly claiming, and it might have been me claiming that that value for myself of like, it doesn't matter. I'm going to tell people what I want. I think I just took what people gave me, but now I'm able to ask for what I want. So I don't know how I can suggest anything other than like working on stuff internally. And that was for me, but I just bring my son where I can. I set up a hammock when I was in grad school for him to hang out and play video games, and not feel guilty that I put him in front of the TV, but next to me, at least he was there and I was kind of present. So I did what I had to do to get my work done, but have him near me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that.
Urania Perez wants to know, is Santeria practiced a lot in Colombia?
No, it's more of a Miami thing. It's a lot more with like my Cuban relatives and my Cuban friends of growing up in Miami, and like the little shrines or the little collection of objects that you're like, is that a Catholic thing, or is that but no, it's not. I don't think that I know of in Colombia. Mostly Miami, where I grew up.
Thank you. A lot of appreciation in the chat. So I'm just sort of scrolling through. If any, Karen, if you find anything that you would like to be asked, please let me know. Shakira writes, please keep dismantling and normalizing that artists are parents too. And that does not define their passions, determinations, or accessibility. Thank you for being this advocate for all parents.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then Karen says, that reminds me of the idea of passing, although never thought about it in terms of respect to being a parent as well.
Well, and also just the double bind of how, especially people who identify as women are kind of expected to be mothers. We still kind of normalize that. And then, and yet if you're an artist, that's not okay in certain situations. So that's just a really interesting double bind also to think about, and unfortunate.
Yeah, it's weird because it's so expected, like generally in culture, but then like when you come to the art field, it's like, oh, I've been told I had a professor in undergrad in like our thesis class say like, oh, you have to make a choice. And it was a man. He said, you either want to become a mother or you want to become an artist. That it was like, one or the other. And yeah, I don't know why in the arts field, it's like you can't do that and be an artist.
That's interesting because I've heard a lot of that going on in the 70s and 80s, and it has not changed. It's interesting to know. Yeah.
But also
I mean,
it goes through other art fields like music and theater, and if you're a writer, that goes like carries across that no, you can't be a parent, you have to choose, when in reality we don't have to choose.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, I'm very fortunate. I have a partner who takes on just as much responsibility, if not more at times, and you know, a pretty supportive family, even though I've been away. But I think we just have to be much more friendlier to families in the academia setting as well as and residencies too. I had a full ride at Ohio State and had a monthly stipend, but I had to take out loans to pay for childcare for my son. That was like, it was so expensive, and there was no support, not even in that aspect. And so, yeah, we really need, you know, leave for both parents and childcare help.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to be respectful of your time. It is after 1 o'clock. I'm going to stop recording, but I really do want to thank you for being here. We will continue a small conversation if you have a moment to do that, if there are people who would like to stay just for a couple minutes, but I do want to respect your time. And thank you so much for being here and showing us your beautiful work and what goes on inside your amazing head. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for coming.